I'm Craig Johnson. Welcome to Literary Lockdown, and happy maybe Shakespeare's birthday. Guess what? We don't actually know when Shakespeare was born, but we do know that he was baptized on April 26th, 1564, and usually kids were baptized a couple days after they were born. So usually we just say, probably April 23rd. Let's go with that. And weirdly, we don't actually know when he died. We know that his funeral took place on April 25th, 1616. So again, we just say, maybe a couple days before. So let's say April 23rd. Then it's easy to remember when Shakespeare may or may not have been born and may or may not have died. But I don't want to talk about him. I want to talk about one of the brilliant early 20th century novelists and essayists, Virginia Woolf, who was at the center of London's literary society in the early 20th century, the celebrated Bloomsbury group, and she was the author of novels like Mrs. Dalloway, To the Lighthouse, Orlando. She did a lot of very experimental stream of consciousness kind of writing. And in 1928, she was invited by a couple women's colleges to come and give some lectures. And the topic they told her, she could just talk about women and fiction. So Virginia Woolf thought about that. And so what does that actually mean? Women in fiction? Women who write fiction? And the end result turned out to be this really long survey essay on the intersection of feminism and literature that was compiled into a volume called A Room of One's Own. And this is one of the most famous sequences from that, where she imagines Shakespeare's sister. I thought of that old gentleman, who is dead now, but was a bishop, I think, and who declared that it was impossible for any woman, past, present, or to come, to have the genius of Shakespeare. He wrote to the papers about it. He also told a lady who applied to him for information that cats do not, as a matter of fact, go to heaven, though they have souls of a sort. How much thinking those old gentlemen used to save one. How the borders of ignorance shrank back at their approach. Cats do not go to heaven. Women cannot write the plays of Shakespeare. Be that as it may, I could not help thinking, as I looked at the works of Shakespeare on the shelf, that the bishop was right, at least in this. It would have been impossible, completely and entirely, for any woman to have written the plays of Shakespeare in the age of Shakespeare. Let me imagine, since facts are so hard to come by, what would have happened had Shakespeare had a wonderfully gifted sister, called Judith, let us say. Shakespeare himself went, very probably, his mother was an heiress, to the grammar school where he may have learned Latin, Ovid, Virgil, and Horace, and the elements of grammar and logic. He was, it is well known, a wild boy who poached rabbits, perhaps shot a deer, and had, rather sooner than he should have done, to marry a woman in the neighborhood who bore him a child rather quicker than was right. That escapade sent him to seek his fortune in London. He had, it seemed, a taste for the theater. He began by holding horses at the stage door. Very soon he got work in the theater, became a successful actor, and lived at the hub of the universe, meeting everybody, knowing everybody, practicing his art on the boards, exercising his wits in the streets, and even getting access to the palace of the Queen. Meanwhile, his extraordinarily gifted sister, let us suppose, remained at home. She was as adventurous, as imaginative, as agog to see the world as he was. But she was not sent to school. She had no chance of learning grammar and logic, let alone reading Horace and Virgil. She picked up a book now and then, perhaps one of her brothers, and read a few pages. But then her parents came in and told her to mend the stockings or mind the stew, and not moon about with books and papers. Oh, they would have spoken sharply but kindly, for they knew the conditions of life for a woman and loved their daughter. Indeed, more likely than not, she was the apple of her father's eye. Perhaps she scribbled some pages up in an apple loft on the sly, but was careful to hide them or set fire to them. Soon, however, before she was out of her teens, she was to be betrothed to the son of a neighboring wool stapler. She cried out that marriage was hateful to her, and for that she was severely beaten by her father. Then he ceased to scold her. He begged her instead not to hurt him, not to shame him in this matter of her marriage. He would give her a chain of beads or a fine petticoat, he said, and there were tears in his eyes. How could she disobey him? How could she break his heart? The force of her own gift alone drove her to it. She made up a small parcel of her belongings, let herself down by a rope one summer's night, and took the road to London. She was not 17. The birds that sang in the hedge were not more musical than she was. She had the quickest fancy, a gift like her brother's for the tune of words. Like him, she had a taste for the theater. She stood at the stage door. She wanted to act, she said. Men laughed in her face. The manager, a fat, loose-lipped man, guffawed. He bellowed something about poodles dancing and women acting. No woman, he said, could possibly be an actress. He hinted, you can imagine what. She could get no training in her craft. Could she even seek her dinner in a tavern or roam the streets at midnight? Yet her genius was for fiction, and lusted to feed abundantly upon the lives of men and women and the study of their ways. At last, for she was very young, oddly like Shakespeare, with the same gray eyes and rounded brows, at last Nick Green, the actor-manager, took pity on her. She found herself with child by that gentleman, and so, who shall measure the heat and violence of the poet's heart when caught and tangled in a woman's body? Killed herself one winter's night, and lies buried at some crossroads where the omnibuses now stop outside the Elephant and Castle. That, more or less, is how the story would run, I think, if a woman in Shakespeare's day had had Shakespeare's genius. But for my part, I agree with the deceased bishop, if such he was. It is unthinkable that any woman in Shakespeare's day should have had Shakespeare's genius. Virginia Woolf then continues her survey of women and fiction up to the then present days of the 1920s, and she ends A Room of One's Own with this paragraph. I told you Shakespeare had a sister. She died young. Alas, she never wrote a word. She lies buried where the omnibuses now stop outside the Elephant and Castle. Now my belief is that this poet, who never wrote a word and was buried at the crossroads, still lives. She lives in you and in me, and in many other women who are not here tonight, for they are washing up the dishes and putting the children to bed. But she lives, for great poets do not die. They are continuing presences. They need only the opportunity to walk among us in the flesh. This opportunity, as I think, is now coming within your power to give her. For my belief is that if we live another century or so, I am talking of the common life, which is the real life, and not of the little separate lives which we live as individuals, and have 500 a year, each of us, and rooms of our own, if we have the habit of freedom and the courage to write exactly what we think, if we escape a little from the common sitting room and see human beings not always in their relation to each other, but in relation to reality, and the sky too, and the trees, or whatever it may be in themselves, if we face the fact, for it is a fact, that there is no arm to cling to, but that we go alone, and that our relation is to the world of reality, and not only to the world of men and women, then the opportunity will come, and the dead poet who was Shakespeare's sister will put on the body which she has so often laid down, drawing her life from the lives of the unknown who were her forerunners. As her brother did before her, she will be born. As for her coming without that preparation, without that effort on our part, without that determination that when she is born again, she shall find it possible to live and write her poetry, that we cannot expect, for that would be impossible. But I maintain that she would come if we worked for her, and that so to work, even in poverty and obscurity, is worthwhile.